Welcome to Into the Words, a podcast from the Highlights Foundation Retreat Center. Today in the cabin is our dear friend, Carole Boston Weatherford. Welcome, Carole.
Thanks, George. I'm glad to be back.
So tell us, you're here this week for the nonfiction masterclass, and you're actually just about to speak. Tell us a little bit about what you're about to talk about.
I'm going to be going into a workshop after we finish the podcast. The workshop is titled Vavavoom, Viewpoint, Voice, and Verbs.
Oh, I love it.
And what I'm going to be doing is sharing some mentor text that show how authors have projected voice, how they have used point of view, and how verbs as the engine of the language can fuel a manuscript, and also how tense can change a manuscript. So what we're going to do in the workshop is first talk about voice, think about who the speaker is, who we want the reader to imagine the speaker to be, if the speaker is not actually part of the story, how a writer can imagine who a speaker is, and that the speaker is not necessarily, if the speaker is not a first-person narrator, then the narrator can still have an identity, at least in the mind of the writer, and that can then kind of give flavor to the way the words, fall off the narrator's tongue, and also shape the relationship that the reader has with the text. Because the narrator can, draw the reader in, can keep the reader at a distance. So we want to just kind of think about voice as an identity that can be conveyed by the writer. And so we're going to first talk about voice, and then we're going to talk about point of view. First person, second person, third person, a third person omniscient, or limited omniscient. And we're going to actually take some passages from manuscripts and shift the point of view.
Oh, wow.
So if most people write in either first person or third. So maybe some of the participants will decide to try second person, and others may decide to shift from third to first, or from first to third. And we will then hear from the participants about how that change affected the manuscript. Was it, for the better? Or, should they have left it alone? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that writers should always do, unless they think it's, perfect to begin with. And few pieces of writing are perfect after the first draft, or perfect even before you think it's ready to submit. So I just think that these are exercises that we can do either with small parts of manuscripts, just to kind of experiment, or with entire manuscripts to see how it changes things.
Oh, that sounds great.
And one thing that this will actually be the second time that I have presented this session this week, and some of the comments that I received in the first session yesterday was that shifting from third to first person really made the action a lot more immediate, made the relationship closer between the reader and the text. Second person made it seem as if the reader was actually part of the action. So I just want the participants in my workshop to understand how some of these moves that writers make can affect the manuscript.
And I think that's one of the goals this week through this setup with the nonfiction masterclass, is to really help the writers think about progress.
Exactly.
And through these activities, they can have hands-on.
Yeah, and actually I have read, some manuscripts at different stages over the past few days, and writers are making progress and trying things that perhaps they had not thought of. Not just in terms of what I'm talking about in my workshop, but maybe reordering some of the action in manuscripts that makes the manuscript maybe more accessible or more marketable.
Great. Well, thank you. We're so glad to have you here. You were here last year?
For the nonfiction masterclass, I was, and one of the participants, one of my mentees from last summer, just got her first book deal.
Oh, that's great.
So we're happy about that.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're real glad to hear when somebody comes to the Highlights Foundation and then they get a book contract.
Well, that's the ultimate success story.
Yes. Switch gears a little bit. Tell me about you and what you like to write for our listeners who may not know you so well.
Well, George, I'm going to go back even farther than that, because what you may not know about me is that the first place I was ever published was in Highlights magazine.
Oh, really?
At about 7 or 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
And it was not a piece of writing. I considered myself an artist at that time, and it was a picture of a ballerina. Or was it a girl in a sailor? I think it was a girl. It was a dancer in a sailor suit. So I don't know whether she was doing ballet or just what. But my mother kept the picture for many, many years. And after I got published, I was asking my mom about some of my early poems. I started writing poetry when I was in first grade, dictated a poem to my mother, and my dad, who was a high school printing teacher, printed some of my early poetry. So I like to say I have ink in my blood.
Oh, yeah.
And when I had a book published, I went to schools and I told kids about, starting to write in first grade and writing that first poem. And the kids always would ask, well, what was the poem? And of course, I didn't remember it anymore. So I went to my mom and said, whatever happened to the poem? Sure enough, she had that poem as well as the picture from Highlights and the high school newspaper that I contributed to in an envelope in her dresser drawer. So all that stuff came back to haunt me.
But that's good. It shows you were an artist from early on.
Right. And my literary career got started after I became a mother and was reintroduced to children's literature, and noticed that the industry was kind of in the midst of what was then called a multicultural boom. There were more diverse books for my kids, of course, than there had been for me growing up in the 60s and 70s. And that, of course, delighted me. And it also made a light bulb go off in my head. I had been, up to that point, writing poetry for adults and writing advertising and public relations copy for my career. But when I saw that, these wonderful books that were being published in the that was in the 90s, I decided, well, maybe I should try my hand at writing for children. And I did, and that's how and when I got started.
And I think there was was it Street Rhymes? What was the...
Sidewalk Chalk.
Sidewalk
Chalk, right, was published by Boyd's Mills Press. That was... I'm not sure if that was my first book. That might have been my first book with Boyd's Mills. I think it was. Okay. I've got 3 with Boyd's Mills. Sidewalk Chalk, a Negro League scrapbook, 4. Birmingham, 1963, and my favorite book, the book that I think I was born to write, Becoming Billie Holiday, which was my first young adult book. It's a verse novel.
Beautiful. And tell me about your most recent title.
My most recent title is The Roots of Rap, 16 Bars on the 4 Pillars of Hip Hop. Most of my work focuses either on the African American freedom struggle or African American culture, and specifically African American musical traditions. So I started out writing about jazz and just kind of worked my way up to hip hop. I'd had this manuscript lying around for several years. It had been rejected, and I went back to the drawing board with it a little bit, and we pitched it again, and it sold. So it was published by Little B Books and was released in January. It's illustrated by Frank Morrison, and it traces the roots of rap from folk songs, spirituals, the poetry of poets like Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar, whose work is inspired by oral traditions, and just takes it all the way up to the present day. Most of the focus is on old school hip hop, and I'm not particularly a hip hop head, but I do like some, and I have watched with interest as hip hop has become the language of global youth culture. So it was really a joy to work on the book, particularly with Frank Morrison, who's just so talented. He's a former b-boy as well as a former graffiti artist, and his art is just fantastic in the book.
Oh, wonderful. Now, did you tell me last year you teach a class on hip hop?
I do. I teach a class, a hip hop class at Fayetteville State University, and it has the course does have a subtitle, so it's got a rather long course title: Hip Hop, Poetry, Politics, and Pop Culture. So we focus not only on hip hop as literature, but also as a political movement, or at least the political implications of it and social policy implications, as well as the fact that hip hop has really infused the business world, both through advertising, which features hip hop as the advertising jingles, and hip hop entrepreneurs, as well as having hip hop artists as pitchmen and pitchwomen.
Sure.
So it's one of the most popular courses in the English department at where I teach.
So, and that leads into your full-time job is teaching.
My full-time job is teaching English at Fayetteville State University, and in addition to the hip-hop class, I also have children's literature, adolescent literature, and business and creative writing in my wheelhouse.
And where does your writing career fit in?
Well, I try to, as best I can, to integrate what I do. So, as I teach children's literature, I'm evaluating children's books with my students. I'm reviewing new children's books, and that's what any writer needs to do anyway. It's just that I'm getting paid to do it because I'm teaching it.
Right.
So obviously the same thing for adolescent literature. I teach children's literature every semester. I never get a break from it. I teach it fall, spring, and summer.
Okay. And do you have a regular writing practice?
I probably have an unusual writing practice. Before I started teaching, I was a freelance publicist, and at that time I had a regular writing practice, and I also had kids who were still at home. So my writing practice then was to write when they weren't there, or to write when they were asleep. Now my writing practice is kind of catch as catch can. So I write between workshops at the Highlights Foundation. I write in airports. I write at home, when I'm at home. But I've just always managed to fit it in.
Good. Okay.
And I do make it a priority.
And what's next for you with your writing? Do you know which projects you're working on, or?
I know what my next book is that's going to be coming out. It's called By and By, and it's a biography of a gospel composer named Charles Albert Tindley, who was one of the fathers of gospel music. It's being illustrated by Brian Collier. So that's what's coming out next. I have been working for several years on a verse novel about my family's history in Talbot County, Maryland. Some of the action is centered on a plantation that was known as Y House, which was the largest slaveholding plantation in Maryland. It was the plantation where Frederick Douglass first dreamed of freedom. He was enslaved there, as were my family members.
Wow.
So that's what I'm working on and hoping to finish before school starts.
That's ambitious.
It is.
That sounds like
a
big project.
Yeah, it is.
Well, thank you, Carole, for joining us on Into the Words at the Highlights Foundation Retreat Center. We're dedicated to continuing our 35-year history of providing the space, the conversations, and the nurturing that goes into making great stories for children. Thank you for everything you do to support the Highlights Foundation. And most importantly, thank you for everything you do to support that belief that children are the world's most important people.
Thank you, George.